Source Nation, join us now for The Pendulum with Dr. Samori Swygert, a platform that encourages the 4Ds of philosophy: discussion, discourse, dialogue, and debate. Prepare to travel from the past, present, and have discussions of future implications and projections with a correlation to African Americans. These topics are intended to grab your attention, cause contemplation, and encourage some form of action. From the world to the White House to the hood and everything good, the pendulum is swinging your way. Source Nation, here is your host, Dr. Samori Swygert.
All right. Welcome, Source Radio Network and Source Nation family. I do not own this. This is a production. I'm not the owner of the content or producer of this content. This is a production by the Chinese Orchestra of Shanghai Music Conservatory. And this song is entitled San Wu Qi. San Wu Qi. So you're probably wondering, well, why are you playing this? Why are you playing the Chinese Orchestra of Shanghai music? Well, that's because we're going to have a very interesting conversation today. So let's get ready to lock in, and we're going to talk about China, U.S., and Africa trade relations, and China's potential impact for global economic domination. All right, so as most of you know, I'm your host for The Pendulum every Wednesday on Source Radio Network. My name is Dr. Samori Swygert, aka Doc Swag. And I'd like to give you my customary greetings. So for those that are following, make sure you tell your friends on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other social media networks that, hey, we're on. We're doing this. We're getting it in. So with that said, wishing you tremendous blessings in health, family, love, career, success, spiritual progress, and the accomplishment of your dreams. Now, we're going to get intellectually intimate. And before I do, make sure you get your coffee, get your wine, get your water. If you don't prefer wine and you want to turn your water into wine, that's fine. That's all on you. And you know what you have to do whenever you watch and tune in to my show. Get me my shoehorn, because I have to put my foot all up in the issues of the day. All right. I'm your host, Dr. Samori Swygert, aka Doc Swag, and I'm welcoming you to my show, The Pendulum. Now, Pendulum, some may say, well, why do you call your show The Pendulum? Well, a pendulum is an apparatus. It helps gauge time and space, and it goes in a forward and backward, a retrograde to anterograde motion and movement. And so that's what we do here on my show, The Pendulum, because we connect the past to the present, to the future, and back again. And so that's what we do here at The Pendulum, and we try to make sure that we touch some real relevant topics, right? The show is designed to encourage the 4Ds: debate, dialogue, discussion, and discourse. Gather your friends as we prepare to travel from the past, the present, and into the future with future implications and projections with a correlation to African Americans. From the world to the White House to the hood and everything good, the pendulum is swinging your way. Now, Let me just get a little bit more of this Chinese Symphony Orchestra in for you while I prepare my notes. All right. So, we're entering some very, very interesting geopolitical global waters, right? We see that President Donald Trump is going in the direction of a trade war with China. Now, he's reiterated that this is not a trade war. However, when you look at what's happening objectively, when you look at the data, when you look at what's actually happening and the different plans that he set in place, well, that's kind of exactly what we're heading to, a trade war. And some of his positions I understand, I do. But sometimes it's like it's a little too late. Donald Trump often gets a lot of slack for his positions on things. But one of the things that we really do have to consider, that we should have considered long before Trump, was our trade policies with China. Now, before we get started, it's important to know that we're in a $357 billion trade deficit with China, meaning that we import way more than we export to China. $357 billion worth, right? That all didn't accumulate and happen under Trump's presidential administration, and I am not a Trump supporter. I am just an objective individual, right? So we know that the U.S. did not accrue a $357 billion trade deficit with China just within this 1 year. Now, you have to ask yourself, where does this come from? How do we get, so ensconced in a deficit, a trade deficit with China? Well, that goes back to multiple presidential administrations and the trade policies and plans and deals that we set in place. And so we also have to look at and hold accountable many of our own American-based companies. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because I'll start with this. And this is exactly why I'm wearing what I'm wearing. Right under Africa. African culture, right here. Yet, when you look at the tag, it's made in China. Right? Says a lot. Says a lot about U.S. policies, trade policies, right? It says a lot about U.S. companies and manufacturers. When we talk about patriotism, you often hear owners of these Fortune 500 companies, owners of some of the biggest companies and corporations in America. And what do? They espouse this whole ideology, and they espouse all the bells and whistles and the words and the lexicon of American patriotism and America first and all of that. But in the same time, many of these same companies decades ago closed their manufacturing doors, closed their manufacturing plants, cut production, and what did they do? They disenfranchised and removed the power and the employment and the labor force, American workers, over to China. So we help fuel China's industrial power for their cheap labor, while at the same time closing our doors in our manufacturing plants and other means of production for cheaper labor. And at the same time, many American families went into debt, bankruptcy, foreclosure, because they had to retool, they had to retrain, they had to get new certificates, new degrees. in order to keep up with the economic demands of running a household, being a parent, right? And the rising costs of living. There's many that worked at car manufacturing plants, food plants, all these things. Many of those jobs got shipped to China. The things that we love the most, my Mac. I like this. It's a nice MacBook Pro, but it's made in China. But Apple is an American company. So, American is apple pie, right? So, as much as we would love to point our finger at China, we have to look at the governmental policies that were set in place that allowed for this trade switcheroo to occur and hold this administration accountable, prior administrations accountable, and American corporations accountable. This didn't happen overnight. This happened over decades. You go down any store aisle and you look at the majority of the products, it's going to say made in China. Let's just be real about it. That's what it's going to say, made in China. So, let's look at this. Let's go a little deeper into this, right? So we said that this American greed for cheap labor and shipping these plants and production industries over to China for cheap labor. Now we're in a $357 billion trade deficit with China because we're importing more than we're exporting and they're accepting. But Trump wants to put a tariff, or meaning a trade tax, on China and the goods that they export to us and that we import from them, right? And so one of the big things was the steel and aluminum. Now that's big. You think of all the different ways in which Americans are relying or use metal in various industries, various services, whether we're talking construction, housing, just think of all infrastructure development. You're going to need steel and aluminum. That's just fact. Hospitals, stadiums, military bases, everything. You're going to need steel, you're going to need aluminum. Cars, everything. So Trump wants to go ahead and put a tariff on that. China's like, well, you know what? If you're going to do that, because we've never had to pay an extra price for years, we haven't had to pay an extra price. Now you want to go ahead and do this? Well, you know what? One of our biggest imports from America is soybeans. So China said, you know, we're going to level a tariff on soybeans. And so soy is one of the big export commodities from the U.S. Market. And China is one of our biggest consumers of soy. And soy can be used for numerous things. Some people think of soy more along the lines of food, but soy is used extensively in the manufacturing process because it's used the way that they derive multiple compounds, structural compounds from the soy plant. Soy has multiple purposes. And so China is said, we're going to level a tariff on soy, American soy. How about that? That hit. And so what we saw now and what we're seeing is over the last 2 to 3 weeks, you saw tremendous volatility in the stock market. If you follow the Dow Jones Industrial Average, prior to Trump's proclamation that he's going to start putting tariffs on China's goods, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was doing very well. It was on an incline. It was on the incline, in the green, doing very well. You saw so many companies thriving. And then once he started talking this tariff and trade war, and then you started seeing the volatility come. And so you looked at the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Some days you see the Dow close at minus 300 in the red, minus 700 in the red, minus 500 in the red, like every other day. And so you can tell that this is going to, if it goes on, if we're not able to, as America, if we're not able to establish some type of harmonious trade balance with China, that we're going to see some serious things in the stock market. That impacts a lot of us because what? Most of our retirement plans, our 403Bs, 401Ks, they are our IRAs, Roth IRAs, they're based in stocks. We have company investment advisors that our jobs hire, and they open enroll employees into the enrollment so that they can get all of their benefits and get their 403Bs worked out, their 401Ks worked out. And so each pay period, you can put a little bit of money aside, a percentage aside, and this helps, you accrue a retirement fund. But the retirement fund is also based in stocks and bonds. The investment advisor for the company you work for, the financial advisor and investment advisor, that's the person that seeks out, oh, we should buy this amount of stock in aluminum companies, aluminum mining companies, steel mining companies, copper mining companies. We should buy stock in Amazon. We should buy stock in this mutual fund, X, Y, and Z. So what's happening in the stock market is directly correlated to what's happening with you and my retirement, our savings, everything. Everything is intricately tied. It's just that sometimes we don't see that fine line, that one thread, that common thread. And so we have to look at this. And so, like I said, China is poised for global economic domination. And so one of the things I want to run down to you is this. Let's start by talking about, there was a report by the Rosen Consulting Group, and this is from an article that was published by CNBC. And some of the points that I would like to touch on is this. It's not that it's just a trade war. Now we're talking about the economic power that China has in terms of how they deal with the U.S. on multiple levels. So let's look at U.S. property. This is according to the Rosen Consulting Group by CNBC. Between 2010 and 2015, China has spent $300 billion with a B in U.S. real estate. Huge. Huge. That's huge. $93 billion of that is in residential real estate. American real estate, okay? $90 billion of American residential, meaning where you reside, homes, apartments, condos, all of that land and stuff, $90 billion of that is owned by China. $208 billion is owned in mortgage-backed securities by China. Huge. $17 billion is owned in commercial real estate. So this is like your towers, your hotels, things of that nature, strip malls, all of that. This is what China owns in the U.S. Major, right? Then they say China is the leading purchaser of U.S. homes when it comes to foreign investors. So, Canada used to be the number one. China has taken over in purchasing the number of homes in the U.S. So when you think about Gentrification, African Americans, we're constantly talking about gentrification that's happening in our communities. The property values rising or the devaluing of property, and then the gulping sweep of ascertaining and procuring that cheap property by private equity firms, land developers. It's not just rich white millennials or elite blacks. These are foreign developers, buyers. China buying up a lot of this property inside the U.S. Listen to this. They buy up the most expensive markets in the U.S. 35% in California. And so we talk about the housing crisis in California, especially in San Francisco. The housing prices are exorbitant. People can barely afford rent. They have people living in these basically like boxes, pretty much. It is the least suitable, comfortable living space to accommodate your lifestyle as a human that you would like. So 35% in California, China is doing that as far as foreign investors. In DC, 8%, and in New York City, 7%. They're buying these homes up like it's nothing, like it's water. In Detroit, China has bought the Detroit Free Press building. People don't know that. When Detroit was going through the big, they had the big housing bubble from 2008 when the market crashed. A lot of houses went up for sale. You have private equity firms come in and buy up a lot of this stuff. You hear of names like Maine Capital, was it BlackRock? A lot of different private equity firms came through. They bought up houses by the bulk. Like they were spending tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars to buy up all these foreclosed homes. China was also, China was using a lot of their own insurance companies to purchase many of these foreclosed homes also. So they are participating in much of the redevelopment land grab in Detroit. Yes, China is doing its thing. But let's move on from there. I talked about the residential market, the commercial market, real estate, but food is a big thing. Food is a big thing, right? Where do we get our food from? Agriculture, right? Agriculture, horticulture, farmland, right? Okay. China, and this is coming from a Mother Jones article, says American farmland is under attack from foreign investors. And it doesn't just stop at China. They talk about Canada, a lot of other things, a lot of other nations. But China owns more than 400 U.S. farms. Excuse me. They own more than 400 U.S. farms. They own 33 food processing plants in the U.S. China has purchased now, for the meat lovers out there that know their meat and know the significance of Smithfield Meat Company. Smithfield's a big name when it comes to meat processing, meat production inside the U.S. Well, it was only, I think, 2 years ago that China purchased the Smithfield Meat Company for $4.72 billion. So the meat that you're eating is ran by what was once an American company, but now owned by China. Smithfield, no longer American, is owned by China. So China has found a way to cleverly, quietly acquire some of the most important things that keep America grounded. But I want to go a little further in my notes. Now, let's talk about something more than just residential real estate and commercial real estate and farms. Let's go a little bit beyond aluminum and steel. Let's touch on the holding of U.S. Treasuries. Why is that important? U.S. Treasury. When we talk about U.S. Treasuries, we're talking about bills, Treasury bonds, Treasury notes. Now, for you to understand why that's important is this. America, the government itself, it makes money by what? Taxing individuals, taxing corporations, and whatever they can tax from the sale of goods overseas, right? That's how the government basically gets their money. Well, the other thing is this. The U.S. government generates money or raises fundraises, by also selling what's called U.S. Treasury bonds, U.S. Treasury notes, and Treasury bills. And what that is the government is selling debt to whoever has the money to purchase these bills, bonds, and notes. And so for instance, you have bonds. So this could be, let's say, transportation bonds, highway development infrastructure bonds, water infrastructure bonds, airport bonds. So many different things in which the government needs to keep functioning. They have bonds, they have indexes of bonds for these things, these entities, these commodities. And so they sell them at a specific price, and these bonds, when you purchase them as a consumer, as a purchaser of these bonds, you hold them. And over time, these bonds mature, and they're worth more than your initial investment. So let's say I purchased $10,000 of bonds in U.S. water infrastructure development. Well, 5-10 years later, I may have accrued thousands more dollars on top of my initial investment. So now when it has matured 10 years later and I decide to call and put my bond cash in, I get my $10,000 back, and I get that interest that I've generated over the years. So that's how bonds and bills and notes work, right? And then you have different ratings, like you have AAA, you have AAA bond ratings, A- bond ratings, B bond ratings, things like that. So that's just to let you know how good the bond is, how it is predicted to mature possibly, if it's a callable, does it seem like they may come short and not make what they're supposed to make? You know, different ways of grading the bond. But we talk about these bonds, these bills, and these notes. You know, anybody can buy them. You know, you could, if you have the money, you can buy them. I sold the Treasury Department. Foreign entities can buy them, like China, right? And so when it comes to that, you have people that own, remember, you're an owner of this. When you purchase these bills, bonds, and notes, You're owners of American debt. The U.S. is raising money by selling you this. So China, as of last year, they've purchased $126 billion more of U.S. bonds, bills, and notes, right? So last year alone, they purchased $126 billion more. That brings their total to $1.18 trillion of U.S. holdings of treasuries, bills, and notes. That is significant. You understand what I'm saying? China is the largest owner of U.S. treasuries as a foreign entity. $1.18 trillion of U.S. treasury bonds, bills, and notes. Humongous. Humongous. And that's from the Treasury Department. With that figure I read to you, that's from the Treasury Department. As Trump would say, China's doing it bigly, okay? They're doing it bigly. So China's the largest non-U.S. holder of American debt. All right? Now, they're saying that China could use their holdings, their $1.18 trillion in holdings, as a retaliatory weapon for the U.S. Because we're holding the bag money over here. You owe us. Excuse me, right? And so they started saying that China started slowing down on its purchases of rising. China started slowing down on their purchasing of U.S. treasuries, bonds, bills, and notes when they started hearing rumors and chatter, pillow talk from Trump about a possible trade dispute, trade war. They said, oh, okay, so if that's how you want to play the game, you want to start this trade war and all this type of stuff, okay, that's fine. We're going to slow down on buying these bills, these notes, these bonds that we've been buying up so much, because every time we give you this yuan, every time we buy these, that's fundraising for you. You're getting money. So you know what? Let's stop enriching you and stop buying your bills, bonds, and notes. China's President Xi Jinping, he's smart. He's smart. If you want to act up, then I'll just slow down on feeding you. I'll slow down on feeding you financially. So these are things we have to think about, right? And so Trump wanted to put $100 billion tariff on imports. Now, the other thing is this. I want to get into some more meat and potatoes. Let me break out the notes. So it's not just that China is one of the leading, well, it's not just the leading holder of U.S. treasuries. It's not that China is acquiring farmland in the U.S. By the hundreds. It's not just that China has $300 billion in real estate investments. It's not just that China supplies aluminum and steel, but it's also the fact that the rare earth metal market must be discussed. this is something that we don't think about and we don't talk about a lot. All right? But we're going to talk about it here on the Pendulum because that's what we do. All right. So I'm going to read a little something. This is some research that I did myself using the United States Geological Survey and some other resources. So you have these rare earth metals and rare earth oxides. Typically, specifically, neodymium and praseodymium. Neodymium and praseodymium, right? And 15 other rare earth metals in a specific class. And guess what? These rare earth metals, that's what's needed to put together your iPods, your iPhones, your computers, your tablets, and America's very own missile defense system. Right? So our very own missile defense system is reliant on neodymium and praseodymium, these rare earth metal oxides, right? Okay, you're saying, well, Samori, where are you going with it? I'll tell you where I'm going with it. Well, China controls 95% of the global trade on these rare earth metals, neodymium and praseodymium. 95% China controls it. And it's not that they control it because they are they have economic acumen. You want to know why China controls the trade of these rare earth metals that feed our iPhones, tablets, laptops, computers, and our very own missile defense system? Because 95% of these rare earth metals are geographically located in China. Meaning you have to go to China to mine that out of the earth, to extract that and process it to get it. That's just where it's located. So China is in a very strategic geographical locale region that's rich in these rare earth metals that America, our whole technological sophistication is based upon. So, in a sense, we can only pop so much stuff. We can only pop so much stuff. We can only talk but so much trash before China decides to, call our bluff. Let me tell you what I found. So, it said China is aware of the need and demand for these metals in modern technology, and they put an export quota on these precious minerals. They put an export quota, meaning we're only going to put out so much. I know you need it. I know you need it for your phones, laptops, your tablets and everything, and your missile defense system. I know you need it. So I'm going to ration it out to you. I'm going to decide how much we put out. That's major, major. And so it said, because they ration and put an export quota on there, it drove the stock prices soaring through the roof. One of the major Chinese rare earth companies, China Non-Ferrous Metal Industries Foreign Engineering and Construction Company, is even building a new plant to increase production of the metals. The new plant is primed to produce 7,000 tons of metal per year. The only real competition is an Australian company named the Linus Corporation. China has pumped out 31,000 tons in 1 year. Now, a ton is 2,000 pounds. 1 ton is 2,000 pounds. 1 ton is 2,000 pounds. They cranked out 31,000 tons of these metals. and they can ration it as they see fit. All right? So now we're seeing China really flex its muscles, right? We're seeing what China can really do. But I don't want to stop there because, see, the thing is this. One of the other things, and then we'll touch on this, I was reading a report from the Council on Foreign Relations, right? If you want to get some good content, if you want to get good geopolitical content and just see what the different experts and get expert opinion and consultant opinion on geopolitical affairs, the Journal of Foreign Affairs and Council on Foreign Relations has some very good information that you're just not going to get out of your regular New York Times, Washington Post, things of that nature, right? They're saying that China is, because their population is growing so fast, they are, and their middle class is growing so fast also, the consumption rate of goods and services and natural resources has increased. And so one of the things that China's Achilles heel is oil resources. They don't have oil. Most of their energy is from coal. Now, they're also working on, solar development, but most of China's resources is in coal. Oil is not their strong arm at all. And so China does import a lot of oil from the U.S. China's biggest suppliers, though, come from the Middle East and Africa. The Saudis being their number one supplier to Iran and Iraq, and then into Africa, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sudan are like some of the biggest oil suppliers for China because they need that extra alternative energy source that they don't have. So oil is China's Achilles heel when it comes to energy. All right. Now, I want to read something interesting to you. This was from when I was reading a New York Times article and summed it up like this. China purchases approximately 1.5 million barrels of oil a day from Iraq. 1.5 million barrels of oil a day from Iraq. The Chinese government is reportedly investing $2 billion a year into Iraq. They've constructed their own airport in the desert that borders Iraq and Iran. That's China. They've constructed their own airport in the border between Iraq and Iran. The Chinese government uses the airport to fly their own oil workers into Iran. And they are developing direct flights into Baghdad from Shanghai and Beijing. The article even explains how China has trained their workers to speak Arabic with an Iraqi accent. The U.S. eliminated Saddam, but China really benefited. Iraq is the second biggest oil producer after the Saudis, according to OPEC. And so here you see the industriousness of China. They know that they don't have oil on the level that they should to meet the demands of their growing population and their consumption. So they're going to where the oil is, and we're not just going to beg. I'm going to build the infrastructure necessary to procure the oil that I need for my country. So they, in the desert between Iran and Iraq, they're built an airport to fly in their own workers, train their workers to speak Iraq. They can that would be, I don't know if that's necessarily the right word, but train them so that they can converse with the Iraqis and the Iranians in their native accent. they're going to work those oil fields. That's commitment right there. This is why I'm saying China is on a path of economic domination if they play their cards right. And the thing that I say is this, one of the big things is China, and this is pointed out inside of the Council on Foreign Relations article that I'm going to talk about, China engages in what's called a non-interference policy. See, oftentimes with the U.S., we interfere in too many and intervene in too many affairs of other nations and other countries, their conflicts. China's just like, look, I just want to come in. You have something I need. I think I have something for you. Let's just do this. I will stay neutral out of any of your political affairs in X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to interfere. That's my policy of non-interference. And they're allowing themselves to establish an amicable rapport with these other nations. Whereas some of these other nations may look at the U.S. like, you got too much conflict going on with you. Every time I turn around, you're involved in this, you're doing that, you're doing this, you're doing that. I'm very skeptical. I'm very reluctant. I'm apprehensive. I have a little bit of trepidation in dealing with you as a nation. There's too much with you, talking about America. So these are things that we have to think about as America and in terms of China as a competitor, right? Now, let's look at this. It's not just America and Africa and China. It's how is China impacting South American economy, right? China's also heavily invested in South America. The Southern Pacific Review published an article this October. The author, Walker Rose, stated that Chile is looking for foreign investors and has invited a Shanghai investment banking company to attend their international investment forum back in 2014. He reports that China already has 3 mining companies in Chile. And the National Development Bank of China is involved. Moreover, Chile lacks the natural resources of oil, natural gas, and coal on a sustainable scale. China has already worked out plans to develop solar power for Chile. So even Chile lacks the coal and the oil, and China lacks the oil. It has a lot of coal, but it lacks the oil. China said, you know what, Chile? I'm sending my bankers over there. I'm going to send my infrastructure developers over there. And we're going to do what? We're going to set you up for solar energy. They know how to be industrious and insert themselves in the needs of other nations, right? According to the article, Sky Solar, which is one of China's companies, Sky Solar is set to operate 75,600 solar panels over 42 hectares of desert. To put the cherry on top of the sweet deal, Chile signed a free trade agreement with China that exempts 97% of goods from import tariffs. Once again, it's how you negotiate. It's how you negotiate. This puts China in a very big and powerful position in terms of trade with Chile. So they went over there, they saw there was a need, they set up solar plants and everything for them, and they negotiated with Chile and said, look, free trade on our on the imports of our goods. No tariffs. That is some negotiation right there, right? In Argentina, all right, so we were talking about Chile. In Argentina, Lenovo, which is a Chinese technology manufacturer, has partnered with an Argentinian-based company named Nucen in a tax-free locale called Tierra del Fuego and are building computers, tablets, and other electronic devices. Now, is that a surprise? After I already told you that China has what? The neodymium and praseodymium that they need to power these computers, laptops, and tablets? Smart. All right? Now, here's the other thing. The Aluminum Corporation of China has set up their copper mining operations in Toromocho, Peru. Brazil has allowed 2 Chinese car manufacturers to build plants there. They're projecting to build at least 100,000 cars per year per the company. Ecuador has reportedly signed a $1.4 billion agreement with China mining company to operate its El Mirador copper mines. Bolivia has agreed to let China's CITIC Guan Group conduct research into Bolivia's lithium and potassium reserves. Lithium is one of the most powerful batteries that we have, that we use. You look at most of the batteries in your camcorders, just a lot of electronic devices, it's lithium ion. So they're over there in Bolivia setting up deals for Bolivia's lithium reserves. And this is huge potential for a lithium-ion battery market. The article stated that Bolivia has 10,582 square kilometers of salt flats, and that's where the lithium reserves are located. Okay, so now let's move on to China and Africa, because everybody knows, as the saying goes, where Africa goes, the world goes. And everybody knows that Africa is like the global kiosk when it comes to natural resources of foreign trade, foreign economics, and things of that nature. Now, what I'm about to get into with you now is an article that was put out and updated in July of 2017. And this is from the Council on Foreign Relations. And it's entitled China in Africa. And this is by Eleanor Albert for the background. Right? So here she highlighted that, once again, China has a rapid economic growth and an expanding middle class, and thus they're consuming so much resources, right? So much raw material is needed, so much oil is needed, right, to meet the demands of the citizens. But China has boosted African oil and mining sectors in exchange for advantageous trade deals. So, Chinese companies are diversifying their business pursuits in Africa in infrastructure, manufacturing, telecommunications, and agricultural sectors. Right? Now, there's also some things where many people are bringing into questions of, listen, is this an amicable arrangement that we see with China and Africa, or is this more so exploitative? There have been instances, especially when we talk about, I think it's Zambia, where we're talking about human rights violations. You had some mining company managers shoot mine protesters and kill them. They were Chinese mining manufacturers. They talk about the safety of work environments, fair wages, a lot of other things that goes on. Good governments, good labor policies, and human rights, right? And so I want to go into a statement they said right here. Once the largest oil exporter in Asia, China became a net importer in 1993 and has surpassed the United States as the world's largest importer of oil in recent years. The International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook of 2014 projected that China will become the world's largest consumer of oil by the early 2030s. Okay? Says China's second largest source of crude imports after the Middle East is Africa, from which it receives 1.4 million barrels per day. Angola was China's third largest oil supplier in 2016. Other African oil suppliers include the Republic of Congo and South Sudan. And we already know the history of conflict when it comes to foreign entities in the Congo and Sudan, because we can start talking about these diamond mines and rubber plantations like what happened with Belgium and King Leopold. There has to be true oversight and governance about what's actually happening. Are the affairs that's happening between these companies and governments and the people of Africa, is there protection? Are there rights? Is there fair wages? Is things going to be nationalized? Is this going to be a permanent fixture? Or is this going to be something that's going to be fair? It's going to be transparent. It's going to be protective. The African people will benefit from this greatly. These are things that have to be discussed. Now, let's go a little further, right? It says, while the majority of Africa's exports to China, the majority of Africa's exports to China, going to China, are comprised of mineral fuels, lubricants, and related materials, it also exports iron ore, metals, and other commodities, as well as small amounts of food and agricultural products. China exports a range of machinery, transportation, communications equipment, as well as manufactured goods to African countries. So this is a trade-off that they're seeing. So Africa's getting machinery to build their infrastructure, transportation, communication, and manufactured goods, whereas China is taking out the minerals, the fuels, the lubricants, the iron ore, the metals. This is what's happening here. This is the trade-off. So you have to keep an eye on this, right? Now, listen to this, because here Africa must be conscious. They must be conscious of where they are and what the possibilities can be, what the repercussions can be, what the ramifications can be, if they're not smart with their dealings. Chinese financing comes often in the forms of loans and credits provided by the People's Bank of China, the China Development Bank, the Export-Import Bank of China, and the China-Africa Development Fund. Between 2000 and 2014, Chinese banks, contractors, and the government loaned more than $86 billion to Africa. Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Sudan are the top recipients. However, these large loans are beginning to raise questions about debt loads in African countries, showing indications of a potential debt crisis. All right? Now, it says Beijing has steadily diversified its business interests in Africa. China has participated in energy, mining, telecommunication industries, financed the construction of roads, railways, ports, airports, hospitals, schools, and stadiums. So this is what they're doing, and this is good. If Africa has not found a way, if African nations, out of the 54 countries, if the African nations have not found a way to construct what they need, or have the resources to do what they need to do, or have advanced technology and sophistication to come up with these railways, airports, stadiums, schools, hospitals, and all these other things, they're going to need it from somewhere because they have to compete globally. But it's the fact you have to have balance of trade. You don't want to get to a point where we're just like Africa's like the U.S. $357 billion in a trade deficit with China. Because we know what happens when you owe. Rihanna already told us that. You better have my money. All right? Now, this is important in terms of perceptions of China-African relations, right? They said on average, 63% of Africans view China's economic and political influence as somewhat or very positive, according to a 2016 poll conducted in 36 countries by Afrobarometer, which is a Pan-African research network. Many African leaders have lauded the benefits of Chinese investment to support growth in their countries. All right. Now, here's the thing. You have the reluctance and you have the skepticism of many African leaders, though. Even though they are getting their infrastructure developed, they're getting the hospitals, they're getting the railways, the airports, all of that, housing. Some African leaders remain a bit skeptic. They have a little bit of scrutiny, and as you should. When it's your home, you always watch what's going on, right? It's no different than you being at home and say, look, you know what, honey, darling, baby, the plumbing guy is going to be coming by this afternoon to fix the plumbing in 2 of the bathrooms and check out some other pump issues that we've had in the house. Oh, okay, sure, honey. Okay, no problem. Yeah, cool. When the plumber comes in, you let him do his job. But at the same time, you have to kind of check in on him, watch him a little, because I don't necessarily know, even though you're doing the service, I don't necessarily know you personally. I don't know if you have ulterior motives. I don't know if you may see something that you like inside my house and may want to take. Same thing with China. You're coming here in my African nation and you're fixing and help build, but I just got to keep an eye on you just to make sure that you're not coming with an ulterior motive and see something that you like and may want to take. It's the same thing. When you own something, you own it and you protect it, right? So same thing here. So you have some of these important governmental and business and corporate figures in African nations. They do have an air of skepticism. And so here's what they're saying. The impression that China has exploited resources without building up local economies has triggered fierce criticism from some leaders. In 2011, Michael Sata won Zambia's presidency in part by tapping into anti-Chinese sentiment after Chinese managers shot protesters at a large coal mine in southern Zambia. In 2013, Sanusi, Lamido Sanusi, the then governor of Nigeria's central bank, wrote, so this is the governor of Nigeria's central bank, he wrote, "We must see China for what it is. It is a competitor." He added, "Africa must recognize that China, like the US, Russia, Britain, Brazil, and the rest, is in Africa not for African interests but its own." He laid it out plain. There's nothing violent about it. There's nothing hostile about it. It's just real. Globally, they're a competitor. And they're here for their personal interests. You don't come bearing gifts just because. There's always a Trojan horse. You know, so these are some things that that they've talked about. And the other thing, as I talked about the policy of non-interference in African governmental affairs, China, this is one of the things that they've said China's been very good at, not getting involved in the governmental affairs and politics of African nations. But what they're saying here in this article, and it's the reason why China's been able to expand, because it's kind of like, aside from building all the different infrastructure and providing all different services, they've kind of basically remained neutral. I'm gonna do exactly what you need me to do, and I'm not going to interfere. It's kind of, let me go back to the scenario that I set up. It's like husband and wife inside of a household. The husband and the wife, they're beefing. You know, we have arguments. Couples have arguments and disagreements and conflicts at times. But as a plumber, you're there to do your job, and that's fix my plumbing. When you're here, you fix my plumbing. I don't need you seeing my wife and I have a disagreement, and then you try to jump inside the disagreement and argue for her or argue for me, or say who's right or who's wrong, or, cast judgment. That's not your job. Your job is to fix the plumbing as a plumber. And so they're saying in the article that China has played their part very well when it comes to that. Their policy is non-interference. That's the name of the policy, non-interference. We don't get involved in that. You guys are having beef, okay, that's fine. I'm just here to do this, that's it. Don't involve me. But what they're saying and what I'm reading here is slowly but surely you're seeing a little bit of flexing of the muscles, right? So it says, this non-interference has been tested. Given shifting geopolitics on the African continent, experts say that while the central government continues to talk up the merits of non-interference, it has become clear that Beijing is gradually abandoning this stance. This shift is notably visible in Sudan. We said Sudan was already one of the major exporters of oil to China, where conflict there and subsequently in South Sudan spurred changes in China's policy. Beijing has also increased, China, has increased its commitment to UN and African Union peace missions and established its first overseas military outpost in Djibouti. Now, Djibouti is northeastern Africa. That's located right at the Horn of Africa, right? Man, let me look at my... So Djibouti is right northeast of Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa. China has already set up a military outpost. So you had a policy of non-interference, but we're seeing a nuanced take on how you operate, right? By March 2017, by March of last year, more than 2,500 Chinese troops, police, and military experts had been dispatched to 6 UN peacekeeping missions in Africa, 4 of which are in Darfur, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and Mali. Now, we know these countries stayed in heavy conflict. There are also smaller contingents in the Ivory Coast and in the Western Sahara. President Xi Jinping of China pledged $100 million in military aid to the African Union in 2015. And China supports African countries' capacity building in areas like defense and counterterrorism. Excuse me. Seems like China's kind of slowly operating outside of the perimeter of that policy of non-interference. The killing of Chinese peacekeepers in Mali and South Sudan, the kidnapping of Chinese workers in Cameroon, the spread of the self-proclaimed Islamic State in Africa have contributed to a growing Chinese security presence. Since 2008, China has supported counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden off the northeastern coast of Africa. Djibouti, already home to other foreign military bases, is the site of China's first permanent naval installation overseas. Let me read that again for you. Djibouti, already home to other foreign military bases, is the site of China's first permanent naval installation overseas. Chinese troops set sail for Djibouti July of 2017. So that was last year. So what we're seeing is this gradual progression of Chinese influence and power exerted across the globe. And we just talked about some countries in South America. We talked about America and Africa. And then we could think about how North Korea has been in talks with China. We know that China is a communist country and Russia is a communist country. So you're talking about allies. There's a lot of things that should be considered. And I say it in the terms of policy, economic policy, warfare, agriculture, science and technology, that the African nations that America needs to pay attention to. There's a lot on the table and a lot under the table. So with that said, we're going to wrap this up today. This is Dr. Samori Swygert, aka Doc Swag, Source Radio Network, informing Source Nation audience that, hey, China is something that we need to reckon with. One day we're going to have to actually sit down and have a real heart-to-heart with ourselves about, hey, how do we engage China? How does China engage us? Can we establish a peaceful, harmonious balance with China? Can it ever occur? And what's going to happen? Something has to occur. $357 billion in trade deficit for America. And you have this pretty good bond between many of the African nations and China, with a little bit of skepticism from a few. But you also have many African nations that don't have good relations with America. So you have this thing where it's like, hey, America and China, who's the favorite? Who's the best friend of Africa, right? You know, you say you hate to choose friends. Who's the best friend of Africa in terms of if they had a choice to choose from between China and the United States for the African resources? Because remember I said, Africa is the global kiosk for the world's resources. All right, so I'm out of here. Next Wednesday, 8 p.m., you know where to find me, on the Pendulum. All right, take care. Peace.
Yo.